Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Whenever and wherever you are listening, welcome to episode number 6 of the Race O'Clock podcast. My name is Daniel Gilligan, and I shall be your host for the next roughly hour. We are going to get into a nice sort of deep dive episode today, really. Talking about one of the things which is a conversation that's been going on a lot online in recent times, and it's something which I have a particular problem with, and so it's something which I want to clear up over the course of today, and it's all to do with essentially passing in Formula One and how it's so difficult compared to other racing series. But before we get into all of that, first, a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, if you are new to the podcast, then please do give us a like, a follow, a subscription, whatever it happens to be on your platform of choice. Because, of course, for those of you who are joining us this week, here on episode 6 is the first time that all podcast episodes are available not just on Spotify and YouTube, but also now on Apple Podcasts, Overcast, Castbox, Pocket Casts, Amazon Music, and others. Google Podcasts at some point is going to join, but for some reason, despite being this enormous conglomerate, this hegemony in the online space, Google can't get a podcast uploaded with less than 7 days' notice. So whatever it happens to be, whatever platform you're using, then please do go ahead and give us a like, follow, etc., etc., diddly-diddly-dee. So what we'll do then is we will crack on with the episode. And so we're going to get ourselves our timer started. For those of you not familiar, I do all the little intro stuff there, and then we go boop. And I added in the boop for effect there, but that is then the timer started. So we now have 1 hour to discuss all things Formula One. And what I'm going to do is, usually somewhere in the middle of the show, or maybe this sort of towards the end, we do all the sort of Q&A stuff. So get your questions in, and then I'll answer them. I'm actually going to do that early. I'm going to do that right off the bat and right at the start here, so we can get sort of all of that done. And then we can then just kind of crack on with the main subject of today, really. And so, to do all that, first of all, we have a question here over on the emails. So our first email question that we've had so far. If you want to submit your questions, by the way, you can do so on Twitter, Instagram, Spotify Q&A. You can do it by sending us an email. All these various means to get in touch are in the All My Links section, the link in bio, that sort of a thing that you see on our episode descriptions. So, yes, this first one comes by email, and it says, "Dear Dan, I have been thinking of which team I want to support for a long time. Would you be able to give an opinion on which team is the best? Depends. If you're a fan of just whoever's winning, then go for Red Bull. If you're a fan of history, then you could look at Ferrari, McLaren, Williams. And if you're a fan of people who moan a lot when they're not winning, then all of the teams really are a good option there. Though at the moment, that particular horse appears to be Mercedes-Benz. So feel free to follow them if you like people who used to be successful and now whine about it all the time. So that would be my suggestion there. As far as our next question is concerned, we now jump across over to Discord. So we have a Discord server. That's also in all of the various links and other bits and pieces there. And so we have some questions from Red. First one says, "Dear Dan, we've just had a weekend without a race by the time you're recording." And yes, certainly the last race was over a week ago. So I'm returning to the silly questions you previously requested. And yes, silly and sensible questions are very much encouraged. Which circuit would you love to see run in reverse and why? Oh, and you can't pick Spa. I think running in reverse, but not Spa. That's a great shame. If you've never seen it, go on YouTube and look at Max Verstappen doing a demo run in a Red Bull. It's an old V8 era Red Bull, so it sounds better than the current cars. And he does a Rouge and Radion backwards. He goes down the hill, and it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying to watch. I would say it's more terrifying than going up the hill. But there we are. But another circuit in reverse. I think that it'd be interesting to see maybe there are some that are coming to mind here that actually they seem a bit more simple. So I was about to say Monza, but then Monza actually, if you think about it, it's pretty similar backwards than it is forwards. So that one wouldn't really offer too much in the way of a challenge, I think, and too much of a difference there. Maybe Portimao, if that was still on the calendar. Because Portimao is just a wonderful circuit anyway, but when all of the big rises and falls and everything are all done in reverse and you've got some of those more twisty sections that you go through, it would also mean that coming out the final turn, what is currently turn 1 in a normal lap around Portimao, would be interesting because you wouldn't have as much speed built up from the previous corner as you would obviously going down the start-finish straight. So yeah, maybe Portimao, even though that's technically a cheat because it's not on the calendar anymore. So maybe as a quick throwaway one, we could just say China because that's coming back this year. That could be a good one to see in reverse. Another question, there's a few questions from Red here today. Next one says, Dear Dan, similar to the last question, here's a silly one. What is the best fake quote that could realistically been said by Fernando Alonso? Love, Red. Well, in order to know that, I think we would need to hear from Fernando himself, really. It's not as if, we've got a direct line to... I wonder who that could be. Hello?
Yes, hello, Dan. I just heard on the radio waves that you've got somebody asking about a unrealistic quote or a realistic quote that sounds silly from me. So I just thought I would chime in. Let's have a little think.
Yeah, well, take your time, because it's not as if there's, I'm doing a silly voice of you or anything, and I'm now trying to stall for time and trying to figure out something that would be a silly quote.
Oh, no, don't worry. I understand. So I would say that a bizarre quote to hear from me would be that Ferrari did a good job in 2014.
There we go. Thank you very much for that, Fernando. Any others tidbits of things you want to throw our way?
Maybe later on in the podcast when you've had more time to think.
Okay, well, that's fair enough. So there we are then. That's Fernando Alonso, everybody. One final question, he then says, does Red, if F1 engineering was to get involved in any cuisine, where would be able to make the best progress? Where would be... Oh, I see, right, the rapid rate of development. Well, you could say maybe British cuisine does need a little bit of assistance, really, because British cuisine is, and I say this, I do a little walking tour occasionally through a part of London. And I'm not going to say what it is, partly because I don't want people to come and find me whilst I'm doing it, and also partly because if they want advertising, then they can pay me. But when it comes to that, I would say that as we go around there is one particular bit where I sort of stop and mention to people now, British cuisine, if you are of a certain age, maybe my dad's generation or older, or maybe even a little bit younger than him as well, you'd be looking at British food being something brown in a box. Maybe some newspaper in it. And that'd be about it, really. That'd be what British food was. These days, British food is much more akin to, let's say, our colonial past. And that is that we go to a part of the world, we say, oh, that's lovely, we're going to have that now, and that's ours. And that's how things like curry become a, quote, British dish, unquote. So, yeah, maybe Formula One could kickstart British cuisine and get it rapidly developing and make the horrible brown stuff in a box a bit more appealing and appetizing. Maybe a bit healthier as well, because, fish and chips is lovely, but if you ate that every day of the week, you would be in some serious trouble on the health front. So there we go. That would be my answer to that. So there we are. There's some questions out of the way. Now, of course, as pointed out at the very beginning of the show, we have not had another race since Saudi Arabia. If you want to hear more about the Saudi Arabian recap, then you can go to the previous episode number 5. Not sure what the titles are going to be for the previous episodes. There have been some suggestions in group chats with friends and so on. Friends who are, in fact, listening along to this right now, I would hope, at least. But yes, we will add some titles to them at some point in the future. But yes, episode 5 for now, for the recap of Saudi. Since then, has there really been much that I want to get talking about? Well, there is the thing that then prompted this whole idea for me to go in a bit more of a deep dive with this particular episode, and that is the discussion around the wheels and tyres for Formula One in the new regulations from 2026 onwards. Now, to catch everybody up, because I know there are some people who listen to this who are not necessarily the biggest Formula One fans in the world, there are those who do, and everyone in between as well, so to kind of get everyone into the same place, Formula One is a sport that changes its rules perhaps more frequently and more extremely than any other major sport. Football, by and large, has always been grass pitch, goal at one end, goal at the other, 11 players either side, and away you go. kick the leather around, try and get it into the back of the net. There have been rules that have been established along the way, and if you go all the way back to its beginning, of course, then you didn't have to have 11 people, you just had as many would get onto the pitch for your side. And that's how riots started. But, Formula One, not quite the same thing, but, over the course of the championship's history, we've gone from big cars with, big engines mounted in the front to then being mounted in the middle and the rear of the car. We've had naturally aspirated engines. We've had turbo engines. We've now got hybrid turbo engines. We've had long cars, short cars, fat cars, thin cars. We've had tall cars, low cars. We've had tyres that look like they belong on a bicycle and tyres that look like they belong on a tractor. There is all sorts of things to go with Formula One regulation and engineering and so on. And the latest set of regulations that we're currently racing in started in 2022. Now, the logic behind those regulations was to, A, improve safety, as the FIA, the governing body of the sport, the regulatory body of the sport, the ones who come up with these rules, always want to push is safety. But in addition to that, there was interest on both the FIA and Formula One management side, Formula One management being essentially Liberty Media, the American company that bought the rights to Formula One's commercial rights. Or bought Formula One's commercial rights, would be the better way of phrasing that. Good England from me there. But ultimately, when you have this separation of powers, essentially. It was something done by the European Union. They basically said that the FIA could not hold both the regulatory rights and the commercial rights, because it was anti-competitive. So they sold those to Bernie Ecclestone. He then sold most, if not all, of his rights to CVC Capital, who were the previous owners, before then Liberty Media came in. And Liberty wanted to make the cars be able to race one another more closely because, of course, we've got all of this technology in the modern day and age. We can figure out how to build cars to a new set of rules that can race closer to one another. Now, the reasoning behind that is with the previous generation of cars that went from 2017 until 2021. In that particular set of rules that were started for 2017, the FIA wanted to make the cars more aggressive, more mean-looking, and also massively improve the lap time. There'll be certain circuits in 2014 when the new engines came in that we're still using to this day, where in that year there were some F1 cars on the grid that are actually slower than the GP2 cars, what is now known as Formula 2 cars, the category immediately down. These days, it's now over 10 seconds difference, typically, from one track to another that we see between these cars. So that's more the sort of place that Formula One wanted to be. They wanted it to be this big jump. It is the pinnacle of motorsports. And so, yes, they were the quickest cars in the world, but they wanted them to be even quicker. So that meant the cars went from 1.8 metres in width to then 2 metres in width, more aerodynamic surfaces, much more complexity, and therefore much, much lower lap times. You're looking at, I think it was about 5-6 second jump in lap time just from the winter between 16 and 17. Now, going into that period of time then, as I say, what was discovered was that when you got within 2 car lengths of a car in front of you, you would lose about 50% of your downforce. Downforce being the air that flows over and under a Formula One car or anything that travels at speed through an atmosphere. And so then that airflow means there is higher pressure above the object than beneath it. So low pressure beneath, high pressure above. So it's the opposite of a plane. Plane wing has high pressure beneath, low pressure above, so it pushes it up into the air. Formula One cars, opposite thing. So the air pushes it down into the ground, gives it all this extra grip and performance. The problem is, when you get within 2 car lengths and you lose 50% of that downforce, you're then losing 50% of your aerodynamic performance. Now, aerodynamics are not the be-all, end-all. They are certainly probably the biggest factor in modern Formula One, but they're not the be-all, end-all. If you had a car, for instance, that was very kind on its tyres, then you could lean on those tyres more as you lost the aerodynamic grip and rely on what we call mechanical grip. Now, when that ends up happening, you start to overwork the tyres and other bits and pieces, and then it ends up meaning that essentially overtaking was getting more and more and more difficult. And so we go into 2022. The rules originally supposed to be introduced in 2021, but of course there was the pandemic. And then 2022 comes around and the cars are significantly better at following each other. We had a massive uptake in the number of overtakes in terms of one year to the next. And Formula One has seen a good improvement in that. But as time goes on, these cars are now starting to get a bit more difficult to follow and overtake again. But going into 2026... coming all the way back to the original point here. 2026, we are seeing a brand new overhaul in how the cars themselves are designed, so new aerodynamic and car chassis rules, and also a big change to the engines. modern Formula One engines that we've been using since 2014 in some way, shape or form are a V6 single turbo and compressor hybrid engine. So about 850, 840 or so horsepower comes from the internal combustion engine, that V6 1.6 litre engine, and then about 160 horsepower comes from what we call the MGU-K, the motor generator unit kinetic. And so that's the hybrid, or part of the hybrid system. There's also an MGU-H, but frankly, that's witchcraft, and I don't want to talk about it. So when we then see these cars going around, then they're going to have a significantly different look and style of driving in 2026 versus what they are now. And one of the mooted points for the 26 regulations was that we would change the size of the wheels going into that new era. Now, what has ended up happening in the last few years is that really, if you go from, say, 2021 all the way back to sometime in the 70s or even the 60s, Formula One wheel rims have pretty much always, throughout that time, with the exception here and there for cars that had 6 wheels, for example, and other different inventions that came along the way, they've been 13 inches. Now, 13 inches is not a particularly large wheel. And this is where the title of today's podcast, it's not about the size, it's how you use it, and me giggling like a 3-year-old when I come up with that title, coming into play. Because when it comes to these wheel rim sizes, they are something which actually you would see something close to, if not actually 13 inches itself, on modern vans, on things like Toyota Prius, other cars like that. And what happens in those vehicles, and also happened in Formula One cars throughout all of that time, was that the tyre sidewall, because you had so much, this big chunky wall of tyre essentially between where the rim was and then where it would actually impact with the ground, that would then compress at high speeds and high loads. So that would essentially act as suspension in place of the actual suspension itself. They still have suspension on these cars, and it does move around, but it doesn't have nearly as much give as the... it didn't have as much give back then as the tyre sidewall did. Now, when we came to these new car rules for 2022, the size was increased by 5 inches, so up to 18 inches in terms of the wheel diameter. Now that, of course, drastically reduces the size of the sidewall. It means that there's much less flex in terms of that, so there's less tolerance for movement there, which means the suspension has to do a harder job. Now, 2026's rules were being met with this idea of a compromise of a 16-inch rim to try and maybe get a little bit more of that movement back into the tyre, and therefore mean that the suspensions, which have been massively pegged back in terms of how complex and advanced they can be, they can't use special hydraulics, they can't use electrical systems, anything like that. It's all just springs and dampers. And so now those teams that have figured it out and have cracked it, they are enjoying a much, much better time than those who haven't. And so the idea being that if you put a little bit more of that suspension travel back into the tyre, then you would have a little bit more of an even playing field in terms of suspension. That was one of many reasons. There's also reasons to do with thermal tyre degradation and warm-up temperatures and other bits and pieces, all sorts of things like that that Formula One is considering, or was considering. And I say was because it's now come out that no, we will not be changing to a 16-inch tyre rim. And for me, that's not necessarily the worst thing in the world. It would have been better as far as, getting the weight down in these cars is concerned. For 2026, the FIA want to, according to their own target, reduce the weight of the cars by as much as 50 kilograms, which, given that they're 798 kilograms right now, you would imagine is actually going to be reasonably possible, especially if they do change some of the dimensions of the cars and other bits and pieces, but we'll come on to that later on. And so to go down in size on the wheel rims, that would have been free weight reduction, essentially. When we went up to these 18-inch rims, depending on who you speak to from one team to another, you'd be looking at the low end of 14 kilos across the whole car, so 14 divided by 4, that's going to be, about, I don't know, I'm going to get a calculator out and just talk through getting this calculator out to be able to do that, because maths has never been my strong point. 3.5 kilos per wheel on the low end, on the conservative end, and then some would say, actually no, it's 5 kilos per wheel, i.e. 20 kilos extra weight on the car versus the old rims. Now, the reason why we're not going back, I would imagine, is because money talks in Formula One, and the sole tyre supplier, Pirelli, they want to use Formula One as a platform to improve their road car technology by developing these tyres that, if they work on a Formula One car and they can use the construction then and sort of transplant it essentially into road car tyres to make road car tyres even better, then that's a good thing for them from a commercial perspective. It's also a good thing from them from a commercial perspective because their tyres are on Formula One cars. There's that association, that brand association for anybody who's watching along at home to look at that and go, Pirelli equals good. And what even helps more with that is these low-profile tyres. Of course, you look at most road cars today, the wheel rims are getting bigger and bigger. It's becoming a standard thing now, particularly on German saloon cars or German SUVs. So we're talking, Mercedes, BMW, Audi, that we're seeing, 21, 22-inch wheel rims. Very, very shallow tyre wall on there as well. And so to make the tyres look more road relevant and to also, in reality, be able to develop technology that is more road relevant, they want to stick with the 18-inch wheel size. And this then led to some comments under this article on the Formula One subreddit, which I then read, and it kind of rubbed me up the wrong way a little bit, really. And it then led me on to this particular, the main topic of today's show, he says, nearly 20 minutes in. And the first comment was read, I just don't understand their obsession with keeping the cars and tyres as big as possible. I wouldn't care if the cars were slower if they went back to the early 2000s size and weight. We race literal boats out on track nowadays. Now, that in and of itself annoyed me, but then this reply annoyed me even more. Someone then replied to them and somehow got 500 upvotes on this, saying it's obvious everyone wants smaller and lighter cars. It's also been beaten to death on why they won't go that route. Now, is it obvious that everybody wants smaller and lighter cars? Lighter, probably yes. Smaller? Well, I wouldn't mind seeing them shorter in terms of the length, but I like that the cars are low and wide. I like that they're 2 meters wide. It calls back to the heritage of the sport in the sense of, you look at the golden era of Formula One, or at least what is often talked about as Formula One's golden era, that sort of period from the 80s through into the early to mid 90s. You could maybe even go back as far as the late 70s as well. Those cars were wide, they were aggressive, they had these big tyres, and they were able to go around and do wonderful things. Now, those cars were actually wider than the cars of today. They were wider by 5 centimetres. The current width of a Formula One car is 2,000 millimetres. Back then, it was 2,050 millimetres. So, for those of you who don't necessarily do metric, that is 2 metres or 2 metres and 5 centimetres. So, that is that is what the dimensions were back then. And if you happen to be fortunate enough to walk past an old Formula One car of that sort of an era, you will notice, of course, that yes, they are incredibly wide, but they are shorter, nose to tail. And so I feel like we could move back towards that. But to suggest that everybody wants cars that are back in the sort of, old, mid-2000s dimensions, for example, that 1.8 metres width, that's maybe a bit far. And then I sort of started to think about it more and more, and this is maybe sort of part one, really, of the, 5-point plan to fix Formula One that I've been threatening to talk about in an episode for a while. And it's to do with the fact that, the size of these cars is not necessarily the reason why overtaking is so difficult. Because then, of course, the discussion does move to that. Discussion talks about things like, they need to be smaller because then we'll be able to race more effectively. They'll be able to pass each other because right now they go to a circuit they can't go past. And it's kind of just not true. Yes, they don't pass everywhere, but then again, they don't pass everywhere in Mini Cooper racing, for example, classic Mini Cooper racing. They'll overtake in the overtaking areas on a circuit, or they'll overtake when someone makes a mistake, or whatever it happens to be. So the notion that makes Formula One cars smaller, ergo more overtaking, is not necessarily true. And what it really is, when we're discussing things like tyre size and car size and all these other things, there were then some comparisons being made to Formula E. Now, of course, Formula E, if you don't know, is the all-electric, almost spec racing series. Everyone gets the same chassis, the same car, essentially. You get all the same aero surfaces and everything like that. But the thing that will change from car to car, apart from who's driving it and the paint job, of course, is then the electric motor that is inside. And there are all sorts of manufacturers that take part in Formula E. It is designed not to be a rival to Formula One or anything like that, but it is designed to be the forefront of electric powertrain development. And it will then have a trickle-down effect into road cars. And then, of course, the aim of the manufacturers is not only it's much like Pirelli in Formula One as the tyre supplier. The manufacturers come in not just because they want to develop that technology, but they also want to be shown as being the winners in there to then be able to say, hey, we won the electric racing championship, therefore our electric road cars are better than everybody else's. And you've got a lot of manufacturers in there. You've got the likes of Nissan, McLaren races with Nissan power units as well. You've got Andretti Racing Team using Porsches, and then Porsche have their own team as well, of course. There's Maserati, there's Jaguar, there's all sorts of others that take part. There's Mahindra as well. And ultimately, most of the time, Formula E and Formula One don't really occupy any similar space because Formula E has always gone to street circuits because they need the constant stop-start nature of those tracks, the heavy braking zones and so on, to be able to regenerate energy under braking. Formula One cars don't need to do that. And so they go to the big purpose-built circuits, albeit, more street circuits have started to show up in years gone by. And, going into the years going forwards as well. There have been rumours of a Detroit Grand Prix, for example. And Spain's Grand Prix is moving from Barcelona to Madrid. We know that is coming. But all these things regardless, there's not really then many places where we could do a one-to-one comparison with Formula E and Formula One, unless you were to go maybe to the world of simulation. And then, well, it's all a little bit of a crapshoot there anyway, because then, it depends on the skill of the driver and the sim. It depends on how accurate to real life the sim is. And then, of course, you have to get a professional grade sim to do that, rather than something like, I'll run F1 23 video game and then I'll run, I don't know if a Formula E video game exists, but let's assume that there is. I'll run the Formula E video game around the same circuit, and away we go. But there is one circuit that they do happen to share, and that is the Monaco Grand Prix circuit. Now, in days gone by, Formula E first started in 2014, so same year as Formula One's current engines came into regulation. And Formula E is now in its third generation of car since then. The original generation, they were so small in terms of the battery size and consumption relative to the amount of power in the motors that they couldn't last a whole race. Their pit stop would involve the driver jumping out of one car, jumping into another car that was fully charged, and then going. And that was amusing in a way, but it was also a little bit dangerous because, of course, then people would rush getting into the cars. There were then risks and concerns of people not doing seatbelts up properly or of people crashing in the pit lane, trying to get out of their garages and get back out onto the circuit, things like that. So then they jump to Gen 2 when the battery technology evolves and matures. And then, of course, with Gen 2, they could then do a whole race. And Gen 3, they can do a whole race. Although there is recuperation that still goes on, you wouldn't be able to push flat out for the entire E-Prix. And until the end of 2021, Formula E continued to race around a shortened version of Monaco. It wasn't the full Grand Prix circuit, but since 2022, they have raced the full Monaco layout. And so when they do that now with this new Gen 3 car last year, Jake Hughes got pole position in a McLaren, and they were something in the region of, I have the times here, I don't have to guess. It was a 111.3 for Max Verstappen's Formula One car, and for Jake Hughes' McLaren Formula E car, it was, this photo I happen to have taken doesn't have it, but it just says NA for pole position, which is bizarre to me. Must be a quirk of the qualifying system there, but I believe it was something in the region of a 128 or a 129. I certainly have the fastest lap of the races. It was a 1:15.6 for Formula 1 with Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes, and then Jake Dennis in the Andretti Porsche Formula E car got a 1:31.1 in the race. So you're looking at a difference there of about 15-16 seconds around the lap, and these days, with it being the same configuration circuit, they are racing on the same track. Now, it's still not a quite one-to-one comparison, because, of course, there are different days in history. They're not both taking part on the exact same circuit at the same time, able to phase through each other invisibly like ghosts or anything like that, to have an uninterrupted experience, shall we say. So when it comes to that, that's it's not a total one-to-one comparison. I also want to make it very, very clear, this is not a bashing Formula E exercise. It's just the fact that in a lot of the online discourse, people say Formula One cars too big, they can't overtake. Look at Formula E at Monaco, they're smaller, and they can overtake. Now, the problem with this argument is that there is a significant number of differences between the cars and how they actually go racing. But chief among which, and the main topic of today, for the next roughly half hour of the time remaining in the podcast, is the issue of braking distances. Braking distances, and in particular the speed being carried into the braking zones. This is the big difference, I think, in terms of why Formula One cars find it so difficult to overtake around a tight and twisty circuit like Monaco. If you actually look in terms of the width of the cars, you can put them side by side on most areas of the circuit. They could run side by side around most of, if not all, of Monaco. You look at a photo, for example, of them going around the Lowe's hairpin at Monaco, and there is enough room on the outside for there to be two cars. Maybe even 3 at certain parts of that corner with how wide it does get at times. So you could have overtaking anywhere around Monaco, it's just that the speeds dictate that you can't. And that's the main problem. Now, I'm not suggesting there is an enormous gulf of pace between Formula One cars and then the Formula E equivalents. I mean, there is a big difference in pace, albeit, but it's not, we're not suggesting that a Formula One car goes at 300 miles an hour and a Formula E car can only do 50. Not suggesting that at all. Nothing to the like. There is a limited top speed of Formula E cars of 200 miles an hour. It's very rare they'll reach that, owing to that nature of their circuits, where it is these short distances between heavier braking zones to get that recuperation under braking. And then Formula One cars, of course, can carry huge amounts of speed into corners because of the tyres, because of the brakes, because of the aero, because of all these various different things. So when we talk about this idea of the braking zones involved in Formula One, you have to think what a slow speed corner is in Formula One. Now, Rob Smedley, who used to be a race engineer for Felipe Massa at both Ferrari and Williams, he had, and I think previously for Rubens Barrichello at Ferrari as well, he is on record as saying that a slow speed corner in Formula One, a slow speed corner, is one where the car is taking it at about 100 to 120 kilometers an hour. There is an old physics teacher of mine who will be rolling in his grave at my pronunciation of that. He used to say, you don't pronounce it like that. So, really, sir? No, it's kilometers. You don't say centimeters or millimeters, do you? Kilometers. So, yes, Mr. Macarian, I'm sorry for disappointing you, but you will be happy with me later on in the episode because I am going to be using some physics and maths calculations to prove my point. And so when it comes to all of this then, big braking distances versus small braking distances. So there was another comment on the F1 subreddit, which was suggesting that the cars need to be lighter and smaller for, quote, tons of reasons. The wheels can be 18s, that's a normal road car size. Also gives more space for the brakes and their cooling. In slow turns, these cars could be literally touching nose to tail and be 0.4 seconds apart in time. How is close racing supposed to happen when the cars are that huge? Number of issues I take with that. First of all, the use of literally. I literally think that people use literally too much in the modern world, especially when they don't actually mean literally. Because to be 4 tenths behind, you would not be touching nose to tail in Formula One cars. Certainly not at 100 kilometres an hour or even 70 kilometres an hour. That figure is going to be important later on. And so, yes, that's just not the case. Also, more space for brakes and their cooling. This is a bad idea if you want Formula One to have overtaking. Because essentially what we need to do is we need to reverse what has been happening for decades in Formula One, and that is braking distances getting shorter and shorter and shorter. We need them to be longer. In Formula E, the braking distances are significantly longer, and that's partly because they don't have as much aerodynamic performance, and so therefore there's not enough drag or downforce acting on the car to slow it down when the driver takes their foot off the accelerator in that brief fragment of time before they hit the brakes. As well as that, there is then the fact that the tyres in Formula E are significantly smaller in width than Formula 1, and so therefore have a smaller contact patch with the ground. And as well as that, they're also a grooved tyre. They're an all-weather style tyre, like you would see on a normal road car. Not like a Formula 1 slick tyre, where it's just one great big uninterrupted rubber surface around the top of the tyre. And so therefore then the contact with the ground with Formula E is so much less. Now, am I advocating for groove tyres in Formula 1? I'm not sure if I'd necessarily go quite that far, but there are ways in which we can maintain the slicks and the size of the slicks to be able to improve overtaking and racing. But we'll get into all of that later. Now, when it comes to the differences there then, so you've got smaller tyres, you've got less aerodynamic downforce and drag and bodywork and so on a Formula E car. As well as that, you don't even have brakes on the rear. In Formula E, what you have conventional brakes at the front, but then at the rear, where the motor is, you then have regenerative braking. i.e. the motor of the car is then slowing it down, not a set of brakes, to be able to then recuperate energy. Now, after pre-season testing for the Gen 3 cars last year, they then decided to go ahead and install an emergency hydraulic brake just in case, because there were a couple of big accidents in testing where the motor system failed, the power unit system failed, and then essentially you had just the front brakes, which are tiny diddly little things that aren't really designed to slow the car down in the same way that the rear braking from the motor is. So there is now a hydraulic brake in each of the rear wheels, and if it is ever used, then the amount of force that will go through it will likely destroy it. So it is very much an emergency backup option to either avoid or mitigate a crash. Now, in Formula 1, of course, we've got all four-wheel braking. You've got a bias between front and rear, of course, but all four have proper brakes with the size of these brakes getting bigger as the wheels have gotten bigger. Now, again, you don't want that because you want to have the braking distances be longer. Now, there is going to be pushback, I know, from people who will be saying that, well, Formula 1 should be the pinnacle of motorsport. They should be the quickest cars they can possibly be. Well, yeah, maybe let's make a spec of car for qualifying then, and then for the race you get rid of your big, enormous brakes, maybe. Something like that. That would also reduce weight in the cars as well. Let's not forget, if the FIA wants to reduce the weight in the cars, then making a mandatory smaller brake disc size than the size of the wheel that they're housed in could be one way of doing that. And so if you extend the braking zones that bit more, it is going to make life better. Now, the reason for this is then all because of the speed being carried into these braking zones. I took a look at the onboard of Fernando Alonso doing almost a pole position lap in Monaco last year. And the reason I looked at Alonso is because he was quicker than Verstappen in sectors 1 and 2. And so this particular area of the track I was looking in was the Mirabeau corner. When you're right at the top of the hill in Monaco, the highest point of elevation before you then start to come back down, you go through the Lowe's hairpin, through the tunnel, and all the way back to the start, of course. And watching Alonso's onboard was fascinating. Partly because it's Alonso, and we love Alonso on this show. But in terms of that, we were looking at into Mirabeau, he'd be hitting the apex at 71 kilometers an hour. That's the equivalent of 19.7 meters a second. Then, if you go a bit further back, when he's coming to the entry of the corner, just as he starts to get onto the brakes, he's going at 228 kilometers an hour. That in meters a second is 63.3 meters a second. So there's an enormous amount of distance that they're covering in a short period of time. And so if we take away Formula E as the comparison for a second, let's bring back this idea of, racing classic old school Mini Coopers, for example. If you're coming into a corner traveling at 63.3 meters a second, let's just call it 60 meters a second for easier maths here. Formula 1 cars these days have a maximum length, according to a technical document I read up, of 5.63 metres. So therefore, if you're 2/10 behind, or if you're even 1/10 behind a car in front, you're still not alongside, because you take that 60 metres a second, you divide it by 10 to get a tenth of a second's travel, it's 6 metres. So you're therefore still not even alongside. There's no part of your car alongside the car in front if you're 1/10 behind. So the notion of the other person earlier on suggesting that 4/10 back you'd be nose to tail is nonsense. That would be if you were going incredibly slowly. Now, if you talk about a Mini Cooper, let's just imagine for a second we've got an extended Mini Cooper that is 5.6 metres long. Now, if they are coming into the corner, say, doing 20 metres a second, which is still nothing to sniff at, it's still a pretty good speed, that's still over 71 kilometres an hour, as we discussed before, with 71 being 19.7 metres a second. But if you're coming in at 20 metres a second, you've got this car that is 5.6 metres long, then all of a sudden you are no longer over a car's distance away from the front end, you're actually already alongside, because that 5.6 metre car in 1/10 of a second travelling 20 metres a second would be 2 metres behind the front end of the car you're trying to pass. So therefore there'd be about 3.5 metres of overlap between the two cars. That then would mean that in the straight line braking phase, you would then be able to get alongside and then contest the corner. You may not get the move done, but you would at least be able to contest the corner. The other driver might be able to, get enough speed around the outside to be able to fend you off, something like that. And Mirabeau is one of these corners that I picked on in particular because that was one of the big overtaking areas in the Formula E race last year. And when you're looking down at that corner, there is a lot of regenerative braking going on for the Formula E cars, and those distances are much longer. The straight line braking for Fernando Alonso on his qualifying lap was 1 second there or thereabouts. I don't have really precise telemetry data on this. I was just going off of a speedometer that was up on the screen that was linked to the time he was doing, all synchronized up and so on, and then using a stopwatch essentially to time when he hit the brakes versus then when he started to turn in. So his straight line braking was 34 meters of straight line braking, decelerated by 123 kilometers an hour in that 1 second. So that is therefore, 123 kilometers an hour worth of deceleration in 34 meters of distance. Then, of course, at that point, he's traveling at about 105 kilometers an hour, so he loses another 30 or so kilometers an hour from the turn-in point to the apex. But, of course, at the turn-in point, that's where another car needs to be alongside to then commit to a move. So that's why I've not taken into account that sort of travel from turn-in to the apex itself. Now, when you're then looking at all of this and you're seeing these cars racing around, then you've got the problem is with Formula One is they're just too quick. Fundamentally, they're too fast to be able to get alongside and then contest the corner. Because if you were a car that was 2 tenths behind Fernando Alonso, you'd be 12 meters behind him coming into the corner. So you'd be over a car length away. You could fit another Formula One car in between the two of you. So whilst Fernando is braking on the limit in front of you by 12 metres, you've somehow got to get alongside him whilst not crashing the car. Because, of course, if he's braking at the limit, how on earth are you going to brake beyond the limit and keep the car from going into the barriers? You're not. So that's the big problem. And further to this, the problem exists within not just the speed they're carrying, not just the brakes, but the tyres as well. And it's not the usual argument that you may have heard before when it comes to Formula One tyres, in that, oh, well, they overheat too much, or you can't push them enough, or blah, 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 blah. That's not the real issue here when it comes to modern Formula One tyres. The problem is they are not durable enough. They degrade too much. Now, of course, we've seen some great races in Formula One over the years where degrading tyres have played their part. And I'm certainly, I'm not advocating that we go back to 2005, for example, where you had to have just one set of tyres for the entire race. Though we'll come on to that race later on as another point to this. But if you have these tyres that do degrade as much as Formula One tyres do, then everyone driving on the ideal racing line is then going to be putting rubber down. That is then going to massively increase the grip available on that racing line. Now, do you know what that means? If you've been paying attention, then you'll know exactly what that means. That means that the braking distance gets shorter and shorter still. But not only that, but when these tyres are depositing their rubber on the ground, occasionally what can happen is bits of rubber are ripped off of the tyre and don't impregnate into the surface of the road, but instead are thrown away to one side because of the centrifugal force through the tyre. Now, that then is what we would refer to as a marble. So when you hear commentators talking about marbles on the circuit, that's what it is. It's little bits of rubber that have come from the tyres and have then been discarded off of the racing line. If they were on the racing line, they would be picked up and cleared away by cars driving over the top of them. And what ends up happening, therefore, is that you see a massive discrepancy between the level of grip on the racing line and off of the racing line. So if you wanted to make braking distances even shorter, you would somehow need to make the off-line, the less quick line, more grippy. You would need to make it so that driver that's 12 metres behind Fernando Alonso, when they pull to the inside, they don't suddenly lose grip, but gain it. Now, they will gain some grip by virtue of the fact they won't be driving around behind Alonso and therefore getting his dirty air, which will reduce the effectiveness of the aerodynamics, as we mentioned earlier on. But fundamentally, the four tyres are what connect you to the road. That is what determines your performance above all else. If you can't get the tyres to work in Formula One, if you can't get them in the operating window, then you can have a car that's great over one lap, as Haas had last year, but then it will just fall away out of the points throughout the race. Haas were in Q3 more often than I think any of the other teams around them in the championship, but they finished last. And, that was down to fundamentally a lack of race pace and a lack of being able to figure out how to get the tyre to work over a stint. So, you could have something like Red Bull, for example. If the Red Bull with the greatest aero balance and aero setup on the grid was chewing through its tyres, it wouldn't win everything. It would be in the pits more frequently than everybody else. They would have tyre blowouts. They'd have all these other bits and pieces going on, which then would mean that they fundamentally would not be able to have a good race. So we come back to this issue then. Size. How best to use size? Because it is not necessarily down to the fact these cars are wide or long that is the problem. Yes, a longer car is less agile than a shorter wheelbase car, so we could make the wheelbase shorter and the overall dimensions of the car unchanged. That would maybe make them a little bit more prone to being able to zip around and turn in a bit easier, but then of course you've still got a little bit of a lot of overhang, let's be honest, between here and there. So can we reduce the size at front or rear? Well, maybe to a certain point, but not too much. The FIA will always be pushing safety as a number one priority in these cars. And the reason why the front end of the car is so long is because of safety. The front of the chassis needs to be able to stand up to all sorts of crash tests and loads and other things placed upon it to make sure that the driver is safe in the event of a front-on impact. In addition to that, the nose cone also needs to go through a number of crash tests and homologation tests at the beginning of a season to make sure that it can withstand an impact. Now, I'm not advocating for Formula One becoming less safe. That is not a direction that any one of us want to go down, especially not after Formula One had such a good safety record for so many years, and then of course we sadly lost Jules Bianchi in 2015. A few years later, of course, Formula 2 then lost a driver in the form of Antoine Hubert. And, advances in safety mean that drivers don't suffer their fate. It means that Charles Leclerc, for example, is still on the grid today when he could also have potentially been killed in an accident, if not for another safety device, the halo. The halo, of course, not many people, myself included, liked the look of it from an aesthetic point of view, but its reality as a safety device cannot be questioned. And so it's there, and it's there to stay. It's never going to go anywhere now, unless they are able to create something that is even safer, even if it does maybe look a bit less aesthetically appealing. So in terms of this, there's then the question of, well, do we make the cars narrower? If you do, well, you've still got the same fundamental problems that we've discussed. If the cars are so fast that you cannot get alongside before the braking zone, from one corner to another, if you can't draw alongside in that brief period of time, then you've had it. There's no chance that you're getting by, no matter how thin or wide your car is. If you're simply not able to get alongside, you're not going to be able to do it. If when you do get alongside, there is no grip available because all of the tyres deposit all of their grip on the racing line and deposit swarf and dust and marbles and all sorts of things off the line, so you therefore have no grip at all underneath you, then yeah, you're stuffed. So what do we do? Well, it's a good question. It's one I don't yet have the answer to. At least not as a full and complete answer. I do think that Formula One should move towards more durable tyres. I think that the tyres that degrade work only in certain circumstances, and the rest of the time they are beholden to that same problem that exists in Formula One, and that is, well, teams will manage something because it's quicker than pushing flat out. If you have the tyres in such a state as they need to be pushed flat out, and that is the best way to get the best performance out of them, then we would see drivers pushing flat out. You go to Qatar last year, for example, when the tyres could only do a certain number of laps before they had to be changed on safety grounds, then of course that was something the drivers could push throughout the entire stint, no matter what compound they were on. And so at the end of it, they were shattered. They were absolutely demolished, and the cars had done a lot of work. Now, if you do that and you make sure that they're durable so they don't really degrade over the course of the race, then yes, okay, you're going to have instances where you will have boring races every now and then. You will. Inevitably you will, because not every race can be exciting. There will be boring races, because if every race is exciting, then no race is exciting. It becomes normalised. And so it's a bit like being a fan of a particular team or driver. If they constantly get success and success and success to the point where you expect success, then even if they're rewriting rule books, it won't feel that special to you. It might do. Depends on the person, I suppose. But ultimately, you will have some boring races with durable tyres. You will. It's an inevitability. But if you can have tyres that drivers can push on throughout a stint, and then you introduce a bit more artificiality to it. Now, people are going to balk and moan at that. But the fact of the matter is that sport is artificial. There is nothing natural about sport, in the sense that you don't see various woodland creatures constructing their own Fred Flintstone-style vehicles and then running around a racetrack they've made up and complaining that another team has used far too many squirrel berries or some such thing in the construction of their car, and therefore that makes them disqualified from the championship and they can't use any wind tunnel time next year. All of Formula One is artificial. To suggest that, this or that or the other in Formula One is artificial is a nonsense, because it's all artificial. And so the idea that we'd be immovable to change is absolutely ridiculous. If that is the case, then we should go back to fuel tank death traps that are made of aluminium and fiberglass, and if you are in a crash, you better be thrown from the car instead of staying in it, otherwise you're going to burn to death. In the same way, we should, if we're going to complain about artificiality in the world and in sport and everything else, then we should go back to living in caves and in the fields instead of having our nice, warm, leak-free houses. People who know me will know that that's not always been the case with this particular flat I'm living in now. But as I clamber back down from my soapbox about wider societal issues for a moment, it's this thing where, artificiality is something that just exists in Formula One. It exists already. The fact that you have to have a mandatory pit stop in the race, for example, and you have to use more than one tyre compound. Why is that necessary? Why do we have to do that? The tyres could be perfectly fine if we were to, as discussed in last episode when we were talking about Saudi Arabia, if the drivers who had decided to stay out on the mediums, so Norris and Hamilton, had been able to then go on to another set of mediums instead of having to go on either softs or hards towards the end of the race, then that could have been a very interesting and very exciting end to the Grand Prix, where they're catching up to and passing those who chanced it on the hards in the early part of the race. Because the medium was a very, very good race tyre in Saudi. The soft was not. The hard was a good tyre, but if you're on the same compound as everyone else, you're not going to catch them all that much, are you? So this is the thing. I think that if you were to have more durable tyres, you would need to have a big step change between each tyre in terms of its grip, and you would need to have a rule saying that there must be all three compounds used at some point in the race. That way you can't just have the teams with a good tyre preservation going on to a set of hards in a lap 3 safety car incident and then just going to the end of the race and it's boring for everybody to watch. You would need to pit again. And so the question then becomes, okay, do we want to try and make ground now using a softer grade of tyre and then get a set of hards or mediums on later on and then do all that sort of a thing? Or do we chance it with going, more conservative now, maybe being overtaken, but then we get the softs on later and then we can really push? Something like that. I mentioned earlier on 2005 as being maybe a bit too extreme of an example here of durable tyres, in that you had to have one set of tyres you'd use for an entire race. Now, that was primarily a rule brought in to be able to stop the dominance of Michael Schumacher and Ferrari. But in that year, oddly enough, at Monaco, we did then see some overtaking, particularly towards the end of the race, because there were drivers who had abused their tyres too much, who then all of a sudden were vulnerable to others around them. They'd used up too much of the tyre, but because the tyres, unlike in today's world, didn't just deposit everything on the racing line and make it so much more grippy, you were then actually seeing people overtaking into the chicane after the tunnel, for instance. I remember there was one of the cars managed to get past Fernando Alonso in the closing laps of that race. So just, on the brakes. Good run out of the tunnel, good run down towards that corner, bam, away you go. We almost saw it with Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton a few years ago in, I believe it was 2019, when it was just after Niki Lauda had died. And of course, Mercedes were chancing that different strategy, having Hamilton out there for a long time on the hards, and then Verstappen comes along on that softer grade of tyre, it was soft or mediums, I forget which one, and then, giving it the send in the final lap, trying to get it done there. But again, braking distances. This is the thing. These days, we have a lot more downforce on the cars. And so, it's a tricky thing. The other thing in this whole debate as well, which I've completely forgotten to touch on, is the fact that if we make the cars lighter, then the braking distances are going to get shorter as well. Because then you've got less mass to slow down. And so therefore, you're going to end up having an easier time braking and have even shorter braking distances. So it really needs to be a case of be careful what you wish for Formula One and Formula One fans, because by making these cars lighter and smaller, you could actually end up exacerbating the problem if we don't treat some of the more root cause symptoms of it. And so, yeah, this has ended up being a bit more of a rambly episode than I imagined. I imagined it would have a bit more structure than this, but c'est la vie. That's just how it has been. Now, in terms of the differences between all of these cars and everything else that we've been talking about, if I just bring up for you some facts and figures, because the other thing that inevitably always comes into the conversation when people want to talk about smaller, lighter cars is, well, we should bring back refueling. Refueling was really good. No, it wasn't. Stop believing that refueling was better. It just patently wasn't. It wasn't exciting watching a pit stop that was 10 seconds long. It wasn't exciting watching cars catch somebody and then all of a sudden that person dives into the pits and you never see an overtake. And it wasn't exciting to listen to them talk about, oh, well, he's been sat stationary for this long, so he's probably got this much in the way of fuel going on board, and so that means he'll be able to go for roughly this many laps. No, it was boring. It was terrible. And I've got the data to prove it, because if you want more overtaking, more side-by-side action in Formula One, I bring to you a list of number of overtakes and average overtakes from every season from 1984 to today. Now, in that period of time, I can tell you that what happened in 1984 was, and we're going to focus on average overtakes per race here because, of course, the number of races has changed so much over the years. And so we go from 1984, there were 16 races in the season. There was an average of 48.8 overtakes per race. 48.8. It then drops down to 46 in 85. In 86, it's 41. In 87, it's 37. In 88, it's 33. And then there's a reg change. Cars then get a bit more competitive with one another, as some teams have gotten it right, some teams have gotten it wrong. And so in 1989, it jumps up a little bit and goes to 35.4. It then stays in the 30s until we get to 1992 and 1993, where we then had active suspension, traction control, ABS, essentially all the things to make the cars quicker, but not make the braking zones any longer, make them shorter, in fact. And then we see a reduction in overtakes. We go down to 26.6, 27.1 in 92 and 93 respectively. But then comes 1994. First year of refueling. All the way through until 2009 was refueling. Massive nosedive in the number of overtakes. Remember in 1984, 5 and 6, it was 40-something. 87, 8, 9, 90 and 91, it was 30-something per year, per race rather. In 1994, first year of refueling rather, it was 17. 17.9 overtakes per race. That was it. Less overtakes than number of cars on the grid. You then go through the rest of that period with refueling in the cars. So all the way from 1994 through until the end of 2009. In that time, there were, and I'm just going to count them now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years. Out of all of those, so that was 15 years worth of time, there were only 6 years in that entire period where there were more than 20 overtakes per race on average. And even then, they never got any higher than 22.3. Then, all of a sudden, we go from 2009 with 17.7 overtakes per race on average to then 2010. And this is a fair comparison because all that changed between the 2 years was the fuel tanks got bigger and we had all the fuel on board in 2010. There was no DRS yet to artificially inflate the number of overtakes, right? We go from 17.7 per race in 2009 to 32.4 in 2010. It is by far and away the worst thing we could do for overtaking is to have refueling. Refueling is a boring exercise. If you've ever watched an endurance race where there's not actually any fighting or any action going on, it is the most boring thing to watch. It's just cars going around, lifting and coasting, making their way through, and doing all this, that, and the other. It's a boring affair. And everybody knows it. It's good for strategic boffins, it's good for math whizzes, it's good for old school race fans who like to figure out the numbers and all that sort of a thing, but let's be honest, as a spectacle, as a show, it's boring. It's also fundamentally unsafe. Because if you have refueling, that means you've got a refueling rig. That means you've got mechanics, that potentially also guests in the garage, and above the garages, in the firing line, if something were to ignite. Look at Jos Verstappen's Benetton in 1994, for example, and how that went up in flames. Look at the number of times we saw drivers driving off with the fuel hose still attached to the car and how sometimes that would set fire to cars in the pit lane or the pit lane itself. And then, of course, there's the cost. There's the financial cost, there's the logistical cost, there's the human cost, there's the environmental cost. There's all these various things which mean that taking a refueling rig around every single race from team to team to team is not a good idea. So, fundamentally, if we take nothing else from today's podcast, And I know it has been a bit more rambly than I anticipated, and I apologise for that. I will try and gather my thoughts together about it a bit more when we do a proper episode on sort of my thinking as to how to fix Formula One a bit. But fundamentally, what we need is longer braking zones that therefore give the drivers the opportunity to slip up the inside in that braking zone. If you've only got, say, 30 metres to get alongside somebody, then that's not going to work a lot of the time, especially if you are over a car length back. If you've got, say, 100 metres to get alongside somebody, that's a much more realistic prospect. Though I don't imagine that's going to be happening in Monaco anytime soon. So, when it comes down to it then, longer braking zones are required in Formula One. We also need lighter cars. The two do not go hand in hand, so we need to find out ways of being able to make these lighter cars have longer braking zones. Now, whether that's something to do with how they end up regenerating the energy in the new cars, whether that's then something to do with the brake sizes, whether it's something else, whether it's active aero, possibly. Other bits and pieces that we are going to, I'm sure, be hearing about in 2026's rules as and when they get published. We'll wait and see. But as it is, we've got 1:29 left on the clock, and I don't really have too much else to say. So at this point then, all I'm going to say is if you've made it through this far, then well done you, because honestly, for me, myself, that's been a bit of it's been a bit of a ramblier one, really. There's been less structure in that, and it's something which I had an awful lot of planning go into, a lot of facts and figures and research and all sorts of other things going on, but honestly, a lot of it hasn't been used. Things like the average speeds around Monaco, comparing the two series, Formula 1 and Formula E. On the fastest race lap for both cars, you've got 44 metres a second for Formula 1, 36 for Formula E. That's a difference of 158 versus 131 kilometres an hour, or 98 versus 81 miles an hour in freedom units. You've got things like the fastest laps, we've discussed them before. The length of Monaco as a circuit is 3.337 kilometres, or 2.074 miles in freedom units. Once again, if you want to go and check any of my maths in terms of speed equals distance over time and that sort of a thing. But yeah, there's some of the other bits and pieces that we've got together there. Now, as I say, it's been a little bit of a rambly one. I apologise for that. It's maybe not necessarily the level I wished it could have been, but we will endeavour to make the next one better. And of course, after this one, going into next week, it's going to be the Australian Grand Prix. And so we're going to have a grand old time reviewing all that back after I watch it on demand rather than watching it live, because it's going to be a long one, I think, if you're getting up that early in the morning. So my fellow Europeans, I would say we're going to have to brave that one out together. But there goes the timer. So all that's left for me, really, is to say thank you very much for listening. If you have gotten all the way to the end, then thank you very much. I really appreciate it. The podcast is going from strength to strength. Make sure to share it with your friends, your family, your loved ones, maybe even your pet. Maybe my dulcet tones will be able to get an excitable Labrador to sleep. I don't know, maybe, we'll see. But in terms of all of that, then, there is also one last thing. It's a very, very... It goes against all of my Britishness and my sort of my desire not to ask about this sort of thing. But I have been encouraged by people behind the scenes to add an extra link to the link that is in the bio on our socials that lists all the ways that you can listen to the podcast. It also lists our Twitter and our email. And that is also a Buy Me a Coffee link. If you happen to want to contribute in any way, shape or form financially to the podcast, then that is available there for you to do for the price of a coffee. So if anybody does want to do that, there's absolutely no pressure to, and I hate that I'm saying it, but it's also that time of year when motorsport freelancers like myself, there's not a lot going on. It would make life a little bit easier, shall we say, if anybody does want to support the podcast in some way, shape or form and wants to do so over there. But for now, I have been Daniel Gilligan. Thank you very much for listening to the Race O'Clock podcast. Give us a like, follow, all the good stuff. Send us in your questions ahead of next week, and I will see you then. But for now, whenever you are listening, good morning, good afternoon, and good night.